welcome to our digital dialogue. This is Dr. Brian, and I'm the executive chairman of the System Council. And today I have with me Professor Nicholas Godano. He's a professor of political science at the Sutton County Community College. And today we're going to be discussing some of the policies of President Donald Trump. President Donald Trump has since taken office as a 47th president of the United States, and he has wasted no time in executing his policies. There have been a flurry of executive orders from the very first day he got into office. Some of these has been termed controversial. Some of them have been seen to, some people disagree, some agree. Some think that, oh, this is the end of global cooperation, and there have been lots of division in terms of opinion. Today, Professor Nicholas is going to help us explain from his perspective what he thinks about some of these policies. Thank you so much, Prof, for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me.
Fantastic. So, we are talking about President Donald Trump and his policies, which has been very controversial. Let's talk about tariffs today. As you know, tariffs has been a key part of the U.S. economic policy since the early 19th century. I mean, there have been several tariffs. So Donald Trump did not originate tariffs in America. In fact, it has been one of the major keys to America's economic development. So can you let us know how have tariffs historically shaped American industry and trade policy?
Well, in order to understand tariffs, we have to understand international relations and foreign policy. The goal of foreign policy is to protect the nation's self-interests and protect as far their national interests, right? I mean, so every nation is in a competition with each other, and it doesn't mean it's adversarial. We're just in a competition. We're all competing for industries. We're competing for development. We're competing for jobs. And therefore, tariffs are a tool of diplomacy. Tariffs are a way to work with other nations to come to policies that could be mutually beneficial, or it could be used to shield industries from being harmed from other countries, from the outside. Countries like China that may devalue their currency or just drop in a ton of supplies to try and drive price down so that they could gain the market. Tariffs are an important tool that countries have to protect their interests, but also spur development, because when tariffs are being used, it also encourages a country that's getting hit with the tariffs to begin to develop products in their native countries where they could grow their industries, they could build out infrastructure, build their capabilities, and most importantly, employ their people to give them a better standard of living.
So tariff is definitely not evil. It's not witch hunting. So can you highlight key moments where tariffs have played a decisive role in America's economic development?
Well, when you look at America's steel industry, you go back the last 4 decades, our steel industry has been on the brink several times because of outside competition, whether it's from Japan or China. And so the United States, under both Republican and Democratic administrations, have introduced tariffs on steel being imported in the United States to protect the steel industry here at home, as opposed to it going out of business or having to be sold to a foreign competitor. So that's just one example. I mean, obviously, steel is a national security issue because building requirements. You look back to the first Trump term, and President Trump put on a bunch of tariffs in China. The United States has a huge trade imbalance with China. China has taken advantage of the trade situation, and our policymakers here in the United States have allowed it to get so bad, where it's about a $400 billion trade deficit. And so President Trump said, well, we're not going to allow this anymore. We need to close the gap. China is a country with 1.4 billion people. The purchasing power of the Chinese people has been increasing over the years, yet China continues to have this disparity when it comes to trading outside. And so Trump introduced tariffs to try and close that gap. And he did to a certain degree. And it's interesting because when President Biden came into office, he undid almost everything Trump did, with the exception of the tariffs on China. And it does force China to come to the table to import more American products, help more American industries. So those are just a couple examples where we do see successes.
Absolutely. Tariffs go back as far as I believe 1816 tariff, if I got the rate correctly, the date correctly, when that tariff it came into force to protect the American industry. This was when products from the UK was flooding into the American market and making making it very difficult for American companies to compete, really, because the British products were much cheaper, and 1816 tariff had to come into effect. But that tariff not only, of course, it wasn't just about protecting the American industry. It was also a way of America saying, look, America is a country, and we're going to assert not only we're not just politically independent, but we're also economically independent as a country. So, and that tariff did play a role in protecting most of the industries then in America. It was very effective. So, as you did point out, there have been a lot of wins with tariffs, although it also has its its disadvantages, really. But tariffs generally has been a very important tool in America's economy. Not many people seem to understand that. It seems to many people that tariff, it's about Donald Trump, and we completely disagree with that, which is why this conversation is very important. Donald Trump is actually following the steps of many other American presidents in history. It's been that way. But its tariff has often presented as a tool for protecting domestic industries. Would you say that they have been effective in achieving this goal over the long term?
Yeah, and let's face it, as you said, tariffs aren't always just about protecting your industries. It's also about exerting power and influence. And I think that when we look at America, America is the most powerful country to ever exist throughout history when we look at what we've been able to do. But we haven't acted that way on the world stage. We're actually a benign superpower. We do get involved in other nations. Sometimes it works out well, other times maybe not so well. But the reality is that we don't exert our dominance and influence as previous empires have done. Now, with that being said, you see the way President Trump is effectively using tariffs. He's threatening tariffs. It doesn't mean that he's going to be imposing the tariffs. He's using them as a tool to get what he wants out of foreign nations. So if we look at Mexico, for instance, well, we want Mexico to do more to help secure their border so that we don't have this unending flow of illegal immigrants coming through our borders. And President Trump effectively threatened the use of tariffs. Now, he understands that Mexico needs us a lot more than we need Mexico. I mean, the truth is that the United States could find a lot of countries out there to make cheaper goods. Mexico needs the American people buying their product. They need the jobs in the United States for the Mexican people on the border that do have work permits to go back and forth. And so Trump realizes Mexico, they may be able to say at first, well, we'll slap you with tariffs too. But after 2 or 3 weeks, those tariffs are actually going to hurt Mexico more than they would hurt the United States. So President Trump is using the leverage of American power and influence to get countries to do their job, to play their role and their obligation, and make sure that the policies that are enacted aren't to the detriment of the United States, and we could be mutual partners and work through these agreements. So Mexico has said that they will now send 10,000 troops to their southern border. They're going to be more cooperative when it comes to legal immigration, and they're going to be more cooperative when it comes to the drug cartels, something Mexico has resisted for decades. So you could see how Trump is using tariffs not just carelessly and recklessly, how he's targeting the tariffs in order to get countries to change their policies.
Yeah, that's very powerful, Prof. You just talked about Mexico. How do you describe the response of the Canadian Prime Minister to President Donald Trump's tariff?
I didn't hear the question.
Yeah, I said you just talked about Mexico, and I'm asking, how would you describe the response of Canada to the Trump's tariff?
Well, that's another thing. We have Canada as well. I mean, when you look at Canada, Canada looks to protect their industries. You have Canada that also, our northern border, people focus on the southern border, but northern border, we see a lot of terrorists that have flowed through the northern border over the years. We've seen a lot of drugs and organized crime flowing through the northern border, and Canada hasn't really taken much action. In addition, Canada protects its own industries, so they slap U.S. tariffs on. And we're importing. I mean, obviously, there's going to be some trade imbalance that exists with Canada, right? They're a much smaller country, so they're not going to be importing as much from the United States. But Canada does not import certain products, certain agricultural products, there's certain dairy products. And when you look at that, well, why not? If we're importing their maple syrup, well, why shouldn't they import our maple syrup from Vermont and have the competition that exists? So Canada too tried to fight. They stood up and said, no, if you tariff us, we're going to tariff you. But again, behind the scenes, the Canadian government knows that it's a losing battle. They're not going to be able to go toe to toe with the United States when it comes to this. And the longer the tariffs are held, well, the more it's going to hurt Canada. They need the American people to buy their products. Listen, if we look at America, we are a country that has enormous purchasing power. And America is the most materialistic culture in the world. I'm not saying that in a good way or a bad way. It just is what it is. We like our stuff here. Canada could cut off trade with the United States, and they can make agreements with 50 other countries, and it's still not going to make up for what the United States would be purchasing. And the same thing goes true for most other countries. I mean, when we look at China, for instance, because I think China is like the main one, right? They're the biggest, the closest to our global competitors. The 21st century is essentially a race as of right now, between the United States and China of who's going to remain the top power. And China's challenging us. Okay, the United States has been losing power and influence for decades. It's not a secret. We see it happening, and China's been rising for the last couple of decades. But when 18% of Chinese exports rely on the American people to buy their products, well, the Chinese have nowhere else to go to make up for that 18% if they lose us as a trading partner. They need us to buy their products. We need them to make cheap goods. And that's where you see the dynamic. That's where you see the relationship. And that's where you see tariffs can work. Tariffs can get China to change its behavior in the international community because China understands it's easier for us to find countries to produce cheap goods. Now, they may not be able to produce them at the scale that China could produce it. But what China doesn't want is us to go to Vietnam and start working with the Vietnamese to manufacture our products. They don't want America to start building its manufacturing sector once again, because if we build our own manufacturing sector and we have capabilities to produce things like acetaminophen, Tylenol, and generic medications, well, that's going to severely weaken China's power in the international community. So China has to walk a very fine line between how it handles the United States, particularly with this administration that has put China on notice.
That's interesting. You are now moving into geopolitics, and I think that's quite interesting. So beyond economics, tariffs, have been used as a leverage in foreign policy. I mean, so how do you see how does Trump's tariff compare to historical precedents in using trade measures for strategic influence?
Well, I mean, listen, as I said before, I think all nations are going to work in their own self-interest. All nations want to safeguard what's in their national interest, right? I mean, countries aren't going to do what's in another country's interest to their own detriment. That's going to destroy their own economy in their own country. It's why our good allies over the pond, right? Our allies throughout Europe have tariffs on the United States because they're looking to do what's in their interest. I mean, a lot of European products that flow into the United States from Europe, we don't tariff them, yet they tariff our vehicles if they're going over there. So I think that, and again, tariffs are not meant to just be used against adversaries or enemies. Tariffs, the global world's a competition. We're competing against the European Union, and the European Union recognizes that combined, they could challenge America's economy. Individually, as countries, they can't. So they decided as a whole particularly when it comes to the automobile, to protect the European automobile manufacturers, and therefore they're going to introduce heavy tariffs on American vehicles being imported into Europe. And again, it's in their self-interest to do that. Now, Trump wants to make it more fair, and that's what people don't realize. Tariffs can be used as leverage to even out the playing field on the international world stage. And so he says that if if they want to keep the tariffs on American car manufacturers, well, then maybe we'll start tariffing European manufacturers for importing cars. Or, he said, the European companies can open up their factories and build the cars in the United States, and then they won't have to worry about tariffs. And so you see what Trump is doing. He's competing with the European Union. He's trying to expand investment in the United States to try and generate more revenue to the United States, more employment to the United States. And that's where we see it's a constant diplomatic dance that is being played out on the world stage when it comes to economics.
That's interesting. Let me take you back to Canada. Canada becoming the 51st state of the USA. I mean, do you think, in all honesty, that is fair to ask? And if you don't respond, we put a tariff on you. How would you respond to that?
Canada will never be the 51st state of the United States. We lost our chance. We almost had it in the American Revolution when General Benedict Arnold almost was able to defeat the British in Canada. But we lost our chance in the American Revolution to get Canada as a state. In any event, Canada will not be the 51st state. This is, when we look at President Trump, two things. First of all, President Trump is great at trolling anyone, everyone, and every country out there. And he knows the buttons to push in order to spark a debate. Secondly, Trump, a lot of people take everything he says as literal. And the thing is that America is a very literal place. When someone says something, we take it at face value, and we don't think critically about the motive behind what's being said. By Trump saying that Canada is going to be the 51st state, in a way, he's mocking the Trudeau government. He's mocking the Trudeau regime. He's calling out the poor Trudeau leadership. More importantly, he's trying to flex American muscle on Canada, and he doesn't have any real intention of trying to make Canada a 51st state. Greenland, maybe. Greenland's different. But Canada is not going to be the 51st state.
Interesting. Let's talk about Europe. I mean, you mentioned Europe a little bit. What role do you think these tariffs will play in reshaping America's global position, especially in relation to the EU?
Well, I think the threat of tariffs is the opening salvo to renegotiate trade agreements that we have with Europe. And I think that's the main thing. Trump wants to renegotiate a lot of the trade deals that were made over the last 30, 40 years that we now see have had a detrimental impact here in the United States, but they also haven't had the best impact on foreign countries. And this is something I think is really important. A lot of people, they look at these trade agreements and they accept them at face value. But the reality is, economies change. Every trade agreement that's developed should be reviewed every 5 or so years. I mean, think about a trade agreement that was created in the late 90s. Think about how the world has changed since then. We saw the internet go mainstream. We saw the development of smartphones, and we live our lives through apps, and we could order things through our phones. So we've seen these enormous changes throughout the economic system, yet trade agreements that are 20, 30 years old, before smartphones even came out, are still in effect. That doesn't make any sense. So let's review these trade agreements. Let's find out what works for America and Europe, and let's get better deals that are going to improve the economies of the United States and the European continent.
Oh, that's beautiful, Prof. As we begin to wrap up, I would like to know what your thoughts are, given the lessons from history. What is the right balance between tariffs, free trade, and economic competitiveness?
I think it's hard to really understand what the right balance is. And the reason I say that is because the economy in the international world stage is changing at a rapid clip. It's not like, ever since the Industrial Revolution, things have been increasing exponentially as far as time is concerned. And so it's very difficult for countries to get a handle on that. So take artificial intelligence, right? Artificial intelligence is now reshaping industries. And we don't yet know the impact that artificial intelligence is truly going to have. What we do know, though, is now we're in a position where the idea of automation has been picking up speed. We've seen automation in industries throughout the world increase over the course of the last decade. And so we need to be very careful as an international community and individual countries. We need to start talking about these things because automation, artificial intelligence, maybe quantum computing down the line is going to reshape everything. And you can't have a system where 40% of the jobs disappear because automation comes online. I think countries need to start having the conversation about the idea of automation, how technology is reshaping things, how to protect the national interests, but at the same time be able to cooperate on the global world stage. And it's very difficult balance. It's a much more complex time, and we really can't compare it to any point in history before. I'm a political scientist. A lot of times we try to compare the past with the present to see what are the same variables, what ingredients are at play. History constantly repeats itself, and we try and predict outcomes. Well, it's become much more difficult, right? Because we've never seen a time where countries have artificially pumped up their economies simply by printing up so much money. We haven't really seen that. We haven't really seen massive trade agreements. It's not that trade didn't exist. Trade goes back to the beginning of recorded history, but we haven't seen the trade agreements that we did in the 20th and 21st century. The economy has transformed. You have, energy industries. So I think it's a lot more complicated today than it was 100 years ago. And I think countries still don't know what the right balance is. They're still trying to figure it out. And hopefully we can figure it out soon.
Hopefully we can figure it out soon. Now, one more thing, not all tariffs lead to prosperity. The smooth early tariff of 1930, for example, it was aimed to protect American jobs in the Great Depression. There is instead a deepening economic crisis, and there have been critics who raise concerns about Trump's tariff. Do you think that these tariffs could backfire?
Well, you do run the. You can run the risk of tariffs backfiring. I mean, there's no doubt about that. As far as the Smoot-Hawley comparison, this is what I mean when I say the economy is different. So if we look at the tariffs in the late 20s, early 30s, well, America wasn't the dominant power it is today. So we can't make a fair representation that that's exactly what's going to happen. I mean, at the time, the late 20s, Britain was still the superpower. France was still a superpower. Germany was a huge economic strength, even though it was going through, its share of economic disasters. It still was a major power of the world. Following World War II, you had the United States and the Soviet Union emerge as the two powers, a bipolar system, the two superpowers on the world stage, and then nations had to pick a side. Today, we don't have that. The United States is a unipolar world. We are the dominant power. Now, it's not going to remain that way forever. Sooner or later, we're going to go back into a bipolar world, maybe a tripolar world, maybe even a multipolar world, where there's multiple superpowers that exist. But as of right now, we can use our leverage. Now, you do have to be careful. Okay, if all the countries in the world start teaming up with each other to combat the American economy and introduce tariffs, and a tariff war does start, that certainly can hurt the United States in a tremendous way. But I don't see that happening. And the reason I don't see that happening is because where is Europe going to go? Are they going to really move into closer to China's sphere of influence? I mean, I think Europe would rather stay in America's sphere of influence than have a world dominated by communist China. I think even Russia, for all the problems going on with Russia and how the relationship has become toxic, Russia understands that China is right on their doorstep. And Russia doesn't want to see a global power on their doorstep. Everyone looks at Russia and China as if they have alliance. It's an alliance out of convenience right now. But it could be very easy to drive a wedge between that alliance. So I really don't see countries cooperating to try and combat the United States and the tariffs. And again, the purchasing power of the United States is greater than anywhere else in the world, and countries want access to our 350 million person marketplace.
Are you worried that the global south might challenge America and that will backfire, especially with the tariffs?
No, I don't think, I'm not worried about that. I think that when we look at the global landscape today, I think that out of all the countries out there, the United States is still the safest bet, despite all our problems internally. That the United States still has the strongest economy of the world, and that those countries are going to want to do business with the United States. They want those gravy trains to keep on flowing. And again, we have to understand that when President Trump is threatening tariffs on other countries, it's not a done deal. Everything to Trump is negotiable, and that's the starting negotiating point. That's not going to be the end result. Trump understands business better than any president, and Trump understands that in order to get things, we're going to have to give a little bit. Okay, so he's not stuck in, well, it's America only, and you have to capitulate to America's demands. He's willing to negotiate, and he will give these countries some of what they want as long as they give us some of what we want.
Some people argue that Trump's approach is destroying. Trump's approach could affect. Let's put it that way. Could affect America's soft power, right? In terms of some people have imagined that Trump could actually place a tariff on Canada, the closest neighbor, perhaps closest ally, maybe closest friend as well. Do you agree that Trump's approach might be destroying America's approach to foreign policy?
No, I think that a lot of people realize that now they have to work with the United States, that it's no longer that we're going to engage. So take NATO, for instance. When President Trump came into office the first time around, he called out NATO allies, and everyone was horrified that he did it publicly. What people don't realize is behind the scenes, the last 6 administrations tried to get Europe to give more money to live up to their NATO commitments, the 3% of GDP. And they never did it. The European community just wouldn't do it. Well, now with Trump, they had to do it. They had no choice. And I think that's the way it is. They recognize they may not like Trump, but they do respect him. And they are willing to negotiate with him. And they understand that he is someone that will follow through, and it makes him more likely to come to the table for that negotiation.
Fantastic. Let's move a little bit away from tariffs and talk about other issues. The USAID that had just been shut down. I mean, how could this happen? Through this program, America helps take care of girls' education in Afghanistan, provide HIV drugs in Africa, do a lot of good around the world. Many have wondered why President Trump would shut down USAID, even if there were some irregularities, some corruption. Some argue, why don't you do an investigation rather than shut it down completely? How would you respond to it?
Well, as of right now, USAID is not shut down. It's just been moved into the State Department, and it's now under control of the Secretary of State. The funds have been frozen for 90 days, and that's what's going on, where we're going to review programs to determine what their worth is, whether or not these programs are right, and what abuses of power happened at this agency. So, for example, when you look at it, USAID was spending millions of dollars for LGBTQ opera in other countries, for a Sesame Street in Iraq. And this is a question: should the American taxpayers be funding programs like this, where the money's going overseas to fund things like the idea of LGBTQ, like funding abortion in other countries? And you have to look at other countries too, because do other countries want to import this culture that we've created here? I mean, a lot of some of the stuff that was being pushed by USAID is controversial here in the United States, but it's also rejected by the cultures that it's being pushed upon around the world. So should the United States, and I think this is a great question that we as a country have to ask, should the United States use an organization like USAID to promote its influence in the world, to increase its power and influence in the world? Or should USAID be used to export American culture to other countries? I am someone that argues that USAID should be used to promote America around the world. It's like almost like a public relations. And yes, we can afford to help those that may be in need in certain communities, in certain parts of the world, particularly those living in destitution. But at the same time, we don't need to waste money trying to export our culture on other cultures where they reject it. And also, it's not culturally compatible. I mean, you look at Afghanistan, the idea of democracy in Afghanistan. Well, democracy and Afghani culture may conflict with each other, may not work. That's why Afghanistan has 3,000 years of recorded history of tribal warfare. I think that, unfortunately, the mindset of America changed in about the 1990s, where it was, we need to force other cultures to become more like us, rather than just promote the idea of America around the world.
Fantastic. This is very enlightening, Prof. But let me ask you one last question. What would be your advice to governments around the world in terms of relationship with America under the Trump administration?
My advice would be, you're on notice now. That obviously Joe Biden is no longer in office. That America is not just going to capitulate to the demands and bow to other countries when it doesn't have to. And that America is just looking for fairness across the board, trying to improve our country, and at the same time trying to solve some of the problems around the world. Both can be done. It's not isolationist to say that, we could use tariffs or we may pull out of some international agreements. The reality is that we live in an international landscape where we have to cooperate. And so the world should be willing to do just that. Okay? Have the discussions, have the dialogue. Let's let's fix some of the trade imbalances that have existed for the last several decades, and let's fix some of the problems that continue to plague the international landscape.
Fantastic, Professor Nicholas. What would be your advice to President Trump?
Come back to me in 6 months. Let's see how the first round of policies work out before I start offering advice. As of right now, I don't have too much advice. I would just say, be careful in the international community. There are some places where we want to remain out of and not get involved in their affairs. But overall, I think right now he's off to a fantastic start in a way. And I do think that the world is recognizing that a change has happened in the United States.
Fantastic. Professor Nicholas Giordano, Professor of Political Science at the Suffolk County Community College. It's been a pleasure talking to you today on our digital dialogues, and we look forward to engaging further with you in the coming days. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.